Imagine you are reading a biography, right? And right in the middle of it, the author claims that a homeless, executed criminal actually holds more political authority than the Emperor of Rome.
Yeah, which is just a wild claim. I mean, in the first century, writing a sentence like that wouldn't just get you laughed out of the room. It could very literally get you killed.
Exactly. Yet that is exactly the kind of explosive claim hiding inside one of the most famous documents in human history.
Right.
So today, for this deep dive, we are opening up a massive stack of historical analyses, archaeological data, and textual research to investigate the gospel according to Luke. And I have to tell you, as I was digging through this material, I realized something.
That's it.
This is not your typical ancient religious text. It's just not.
No, not at all. I mean, when you strip away the centuries of stained glass and, polite religious tradition, what you are looking at is a profound sociological disruptor.
Oh, for sure.
It serves as this crucial hinge in the ancient world. It takes the old covenantal promises made to the nation of Israel and pivots them entirely outward.
Launching that global mission to the Gentiles.
Exactly. But it does this by weaponizing history. It is a literary masterpiece that refuses to let you separate profound cosmic theology from the gritty, dirt under your fingernails reality of the first century Mediterranean.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We aren't here to just do a basic Sunday school overview.
Right.
We want to investigate how this single ancient text took the established ironclad power structures of the Roman world and completely flipped them upside down.
It's fascinating.
So whether you are a history buff fascinated by antiquity, a sociology nerd looking at class dynamics, or just someone trying to figure out how ancient texts shaped the way we think about wealth and power today, this material is going to challenge you.
It demands that kind of multidisciplinary lens, You really can't understand the theological claims of this text unless you understand the political water it was swimming in.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning, because when you open this document, you don't start with a mystical poem or a mythical once upon a time.
No, you don't.
You hit this prologue, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And it reads so much like a modern investigative journalist laying out their methodology before a true crime documentary.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because the author explicitly claims to have conducted an orderly investigation, right, relying on earlier written accounts and eyewitness testimony. And he says he's writing this all down to give certainty to a guy named Theophilus.
Yeah, the prologue is fascinating because it is the closest thing we have in any of the Gospels to a formal Greco-Roman historiographical preface.
Wait, what does that mean exactly? Like a formal preface?
Well, think about ancient historians like Herodotus or Thucydides. When they wrote, they would begin by stating their method, their sources, and their purpose.
Oh, I see.
This author is adopting that exact, highly educated literary convention. He is signaling to his original audience, who were likely Greek-speaking, Gentile-leaning Christians, that this isn't a myth.
Right.
He says he has carefully investigated everything from the beginning. He's anchoring the narrative in verifiable memory.
Okay, let's unpack this verifiable memory thing, though. I thought to push back on that claim for a second.
Sure.
We keep saying the author, or he, but technically speaking, the text itself is anonymous, right?
He's technically.
The author never actually signs his name to it. I mean, traditional attribution points to a guy named Luke, who is known as the Apostle Paul's beloved physician and traveling companion.
Right, the beloved physician.
But critical scholarship often views the author simply as a highly educated Greek-speaking historian whose exact identity we can't, definitively prove just from reading the scroll.
That is true.
So if the text is anonymous, doesn't that inherently weaken the investigative journalist credibility? I mean, how can you trust an investigation if you don't know who the detective is?
Well, that is the natural modern reflex for sure. But we have to understand how ancient literature operated. Anonymity was actually incredibly common.
Right.
Oh yeah, especially for texts written for a specific tight-knit community, where the author's identity was already universally known. It wasn't seen as deceptive at all. It was just a convention.
Okay, that makes sense. Like, they didn't need a title page because the guy handing you the scroll is like, yeah, Luke wrote this.
Exactly. Now, the early Christian tradition overwhelmingly, and very early on, preserves the attribution to Luke the physician.
Right.
And while modern historians demand a high burden of absolute proof, which we just don't have, like a signed birth certificate, the traditional attribution actually makes a lot of sense.
Why is that? What's the internal evidence?
The author clearly has a highly polished command of the Greek language, an intimate understanding of Jewish scripture, and a very sophisticated grasp of medical and societal terminology.
So whether it was specifically Luke the physician or an anonymous historian theologian from the exact same circle, the internal evidence points to someone deeply committed to getting the history right.
Correct. And we also have to consider the time frame here.
Okay, when are we talking?
The date of composition is generally placed by scholars somewhere between 75 and 90 CE. There's a lively debate there. Some push it earlier to the 60s, some a bit later.
Right, I saw that in the sources.
But a late 70s to 80s date fixed the scholarly consensus of when this author would have had access to other shared written sources and how this text sets up its sequel, the Book of Acts.
And the backdrop of when and where this is happening is just suffocating. It is unfolding under the massive, inescapable shadow of the Roman Empire.
Oh, absolutely.
As I was reading through the context, it felt like the author was just dropping the names of the most powerful people in human history left and right. Augustus, who essentially built the Roman Principate, Tiberius Caesar, Herod the Great, Pontius Pilate.
He is absolutely name-dropping, and it is highly intentional.
Yeah.
If you look at Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, it is one of the most dense collections of specific historical markers in ancient literature.
Like giving us exact coordinates.
Exactly. The author writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene.
Okay, hold on. Tetrarch is one of those words that sounds important but means absolutely nothing to a modern listener. What exactly is a tetrarch?
That's a good point. A tetrarch originally meant the ruler of a fourth part of a region.
A fourth part.
Right. But in the Roman context, it essentially meant a minor client king. These were local rulers, middle managers, basically, who were allowed to hold a semblance of power over a specific territory as long as they paid their taxes and kept the peace for Rome.
Got it.
By listing all these middle managers alongside the emperor and the high priests, Luke is giving us a massive, multi-layered cross-section of political, regional, and religious authority.
It's like he's dropping a pin on a GPS map, but for time instead of space.
That's a perfect analogy.
He's making sure the reader knows this didn't happen once upon a time in a galaxy far away. It happened right here, while this guy was emperor, this guy was the local puppet king, and this guy was the religious boss.
It is a profound political statement. By naming Augustus the emperor, famous for bringing the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, through violent conquest, and then introducing Jesus as the true bringer of peace, the author is setting up a totally subversive contrast.
Wow, yeah.
He is anchoring salvation history in gritty political time to show that God's ultimate plan is colliding directly with the highly visible, heavily armed power structures of Rome.
Okay, so if he is making these massive claims anchored to real-world geography and real Roman governors, then we have to move from the parchment to the dirt.
Let's do it.
We need to look at what the literal ground tells us. How does the archaeological record stack up against Luke's very specific name-dropping?
Archaeology is where the textual claims meet the physical reality. And for a long time, skeptics pointed to the gospel accounts and said, look, these texts mention people and places that don't exist in the broader Roman archives.
Because they just couldn't find them in other records.
Exactly. But modern archaeology has fundamentally shifted that conversation. The physical evidence corroborating the administrative framework Luke describes is incredibly strong today.
Okay, let's start with the big one, because to me, this is the ultimate mic drop of biblical archaeology, the Pilate stone. Explain the significance of this.
This is a huge one. Before 1961, outside of the New Testament and a few ancient historians like Josephus or Tacitus, there was almost zero physical contemporary evidence that Pontius Pilate even existed.
Which is crazy to think about now.
It is. Some historians legitimately argued he might have been an exaggerated figure or a literary invention to serve as a foil for Jesus.
Wow, but then they found something.
Yes. An Italian archaeological team was excavating a Roman theater in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, which was the Roman administrative capital of the region.
And what did they find?
They found a piece of limestone that had been repurposed as a stair step.
A stair step? Seriously?
Seriously. But when they looked at the original face of the stone, it bore an inscription dedicating a temple to the Emperor Tiberius. And the person making the dedication was clearly named in Latin Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
Wow. So it not only confirms he was a real historical guy, but it gets his exact title right.
Precisely.
He wasn't just a generic ruler, he was the Roman prefect. It perfectly matches the legal and historical setting of the trial narrative in Luke, where Jesus is handed over to Roman authority.
It proves that the political backdrop of the narrative isn't a fairy tale. And we see this stability in the manuscript tradition as well.
How so?
Well, there is an early papyrus witness known as P75, discovered in Egypt, which dates to the late 2nd or early 3rd century. It explicitly preserves the title Gospel according to Luke.
Oh, that early.
Yes. This tells us that the text was circulating widely very early on, and its association with Luke was established long before the major church councils, centuries later.
But it's not just the big Roman elites that get verified, right? The text talks constantly about Nazareth, this tiny village where Jesus grows up. I was reading that for centuries, people questioned if Nazareth was even a real place in the 1st century.
That's completely true. Nazareth was an incredibly insignificant backwater agricultural hamlet in the hills of Galilee.
Just a tiny speck on the map.
Exactly. Roman historians like Suetonius or even Jewish historians like Josephus never bothered to write about it because nothing important ever happened there.
Right.
But extensive modern archaeological surveys have confirmed that there was indeed a 1st century Galilean settlement there. They found terraces, wine presses, tombs, and a central water source, often referred to as St. Mary's Well.
So even if we can't pinpoint the exact carpenter's shop, the broader reality of the village is undeniable.
Exactly. The setting is historically robust, and then there's a big, but as much as archaeology corroborates things like Pilate and Nazareth, we have to talk about the elephant in the room.
Oh, the major historical headache for anyone defending Luke's absolute meticulousness.
Yes. The Quirinius census.
Okay, yeah.
The census of Quirinius in Luke chapter 2. It is perhaps the most famous and fiercely debated chronological puzzle in the entire New Testament.
So help me understand why this is such a massive problem, because earlier I compared Luke to an investigative journalist.
Right.
But if we look at the timeline here, it's like watching a meticulously crafted historical movie set in 1970. The cars are right, the clothes are right, the president on the TV is right. But then a character turns on the radio and a hit song from 1985 starts playing.
That is a great
It
comparison.
just shatters the timeline. So what is the chronological clash in Luke?
Well, here are the mechanics of the problem. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, says that Caesar Augustus decreed a census should be taken in the entire Roman world.
Okay.
And it adds this specific detail. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. This census is the narrative mechanism that forces Mary and Joseph to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem.
Okay, so far so good. That sounds like standard history.
But historically, we hit a wall. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, who is our primary non-biblical source for this era, the Roman official Quirinius did indeed conduct a major, highly controversial census in Judea. But that census happened in 6 CE, after the Romans deposed the local ruler and officially annexed Judea as a direct Roman province.
Right. But in chapter 1, Luke also explicitly sets the events surrounding the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus during the reign of King Herod the Great.
And that is the collision. We know from overwhelming historical and numismatic evidence, coins, records, Josephus, that Herod the Great died in 4 BCE.
Wow. Okay, so you have a massive 10-year gap.
Exactly. If Jesus was born under Herod, he was born no later than 4 BCE. If he was born during the census of Quirinius, he was born in 6 CE.
That's a huge discrepancy.
The straightforward reading of the text creates a glaring contradiction.
So how do scholars deal with this? Because it seems wild that an author who goes out of his way to accurately name-drop Tiberius, Pilate, and Philip the Tetrarch would just completely fumble a 10-year discrepancy regarding the central event of his entire book.
It is the ultimate puzzle, and historians and scholars generally approach this by falling into 2 distinct camps.
What's the first camp?
The first camp focuses on harmonization. They argue that Luke, being a careful historian, wouldn't make such an obvious blunder, so there must be a linguistic or historical solution we are just missing.
Like what? What's the workaround they suggest?
Linguistically, some scholars point to the Greek word prote, which is translated as first in the phrase the first census.
Right.
They argue it could legitimately be translated as before. So the text would read, this was the census that took place before Quirinius was governor.
Okay, I see. And what about a historical workaround?
Yeah. Other scholars look for historical loopholes, suggesting that Quirinius might have had an earlier, unrecorded military or administrative command in the region during the end of Herod's life, overseeing a local registration of oaths to Augustus.
I mean, I have to be honest, that feels a little convenient. Like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong spot by trimming the edges. What does the other camp say?
The other camp, which encompasses a large portion of modern critical scholarship, argues that we just have to accept it as a historical error.
Just a straight up mistake.
Yeah. Their view is that Luke, writing decades after the fact, had access to two distinct historical memories. One, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem during the time of Herod, and two, that a massive traumatic Roman census occurred around that era, sparking tax revolts and shaping the political landscape.
Oh, so he kind of merged them.
In this view, yes.
Oh.
Luke telescoped those two events together to create a theological narrative framework to move the family from Nazareth to Bethlehem.
So, as someone reading this today, how much does that discrepancy matter? If the author made a mistake about the date of the census, does the whole history fall apart?
Well, that really depends on what you expect the text to be.
Hmm.
If you expect it to function like a flawless modern timeline, it's a major stumbling block.
Right, because modern history has strict chronological rules.
Exactly. But if you read it as an ancient historical narrative, recognizing this debate doesn't erase the incredible amount of physical and political detail Luke gets entirely right.
Like the pilot stone.
Right. Archaeology proves that Roman censuses and registrations were administered in ways compatible with Luke's general description of people returning to their ancestral homes. The physical world of Rome and Judea that Luke describes is chillingly accurate.
Wow.
And that physical world is what birthed the brutal social world of the first century.
Which is really where the fireworks happen in this text. Because you can't understand the physical world without understanding the social structures that govern the people living in it. As I was going through the notes for this deep dive, the phrase that kept coming up to describe Luke's vision was the upside-down kingdom. And to understand why it's upside down, we really have to unpack how suffocating the right-side-up world was back then.
That's a great point. We project a lot of modern sensibilities onto the ancient world. We think in terms of democracies, middle classes, and individual rights.
Yeah, which just didn't exist.
None of that existed. The first century Mediterranean world was brutally stratified. Your entire existence was dictated by class, gender, and two massive societal forces, honor-shame dynamics, and the patronage system.
Let's break those down because they are so crucial to everything Luke is doing. What does a society driven by honor and shame actually look like?
Well, in our modern culture, honor is mostly internal. It's about having a good conscience or personal integrity. In antiquity, honor was entirely external.
Like reputation.
Exactly. It was your public reputation, your social capital, your perceived value in the eyes of the community. And it was viewed as a limited commodity, a zero-sum game.
Wait, so if someone gets more honor, someone else has to lose it?
Exactly. If I gain honor in a public debate or a financial transaction, I have essentially taken that honor from you. Every single interaction, who you greeted in the marketplace, where you sat at a dinner party, who you married, was a highly calculated negotiation of status.
That sounds exhausting, and I assume the reverse is shame.
Yes, and shame wasn't just embarrassment, it was social death. If you lost your honor, you lost your ability to function in society.
And layered on top of that anxiety is the patronage system. From what I understand from the sources, the patronage system functioned a lot like a mafia protection racket, mixed with an exclusive VIP club.
That's a very vivid way to describe it.
You have an ultra-wealthy, powerful patron who controls resources, land, and legal protection. And then you have clients who need those things. The patron gives the client a farm or money, but in return, the client owes the patron absolute loyalty, public praise, political support, and a cut of the profits. It's a web of mutual obligation. But it's entirely rigged to ensure the rich stay rich and the poor stay eternally indebted.
That is exactly how the Roman economy operated. It was entirely transactional. You only gave gifts to people who could pay you back or increase your status.
Right.
And into this rigid, honor-obsessed transactional world, Luke introduces the major programmatic theme of his gospel radical reversal.
The upside-down kingdom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The proud are brought low, and the lowly are exalted.
And he doesn't wait to introduce this either. It happens in the very first chapter. You have Mary, who is a young, completely insignificant peasant girl from that backwater town of Nazareth.
Yes.
And she breaks out into this song, which tradition calls the Magnificat in Luke 1. When you actually read the lyrics of this song, she literally sings that God has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty.
It is an absolute manifesto. The Magnificat is a theological earthquake. Mary is announcing that the kingdom of God is not going to operate by the rules of Roman patronage or religious elitism.
It's an absolute inversion of the expected social order.
It is. We see this explicit reversal again in Luke chapter 6 with a section of teachings known as the blessings and the woes. Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are poor, but woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort."
In a society where wealth and honor were viewed as direct evidence of divine favor, saying, "Woe to you who are rich," is not just controversial, it's wildly offensive.
Deeply offensive.
And this reversal isn't just about class. One of the most striking things highlighted in our analysis is how Luke portrays women. The prominence of women in this gospel is completely unprecedented relative to the other historical texts of the era.
We have to understand the legal and social mechanisms of first-century patriarchy to grasp how shocking this was.
Right, because women had very little power.
It's exactly. In both Jewish and Roman cultures at the time, women were largely excluded from public religious leadership. More importantly, a woman's legal testimony was generally considered inadmissible or highly suspect in court.
They couldn't even testify.
Rarely. They were viewed socially as dependents first to their fathers, then to their husbands.
But then you read Luke, and the women are everywhere. They're driving the plot.
Yes, they are.
You have Mary and Elizabeth in the first chapters. You have the prophetess Anna in the temple. You have the widow of Nain. You have the infamous sinful woman who crashes a Pharisee's dinner party to wash Jesus' feet. You have Mary and Martha.
It's a huge list.
You even have a group of wealthy women explicitly named in chapter 8 who are financially bankrolling Jesus' traveling ministry.
Luke repeatedly foregrounds women, making them the heroes of the stories, the models of faithful discipleship, and crucially, the primary witnesses to the empty tomb at the end of the narrative.
Which, if you were trying to make up a story back then, you wouldn't do, right?
Exactly. If you are a first-century author trying to invent a believable hoax, making women your primary eyewitnesses is the worst possible strategy because your audience wouldn't accept their testimony.
Wow.
By elevating them, Luke is doing something deeply subversive. He doesn't magically erase ancient patriarchy overnight, but he insists, structurally and theologically, that in the kingdom of God, the marginalized are brought to the very center.
Reconstituting humanity across all those status lines.
Precisely.
So let's talk about how this reversal actually played out in day-to-day life, because one thing that fascinated me in the research was the concept of table fellowship. It seems like every time Jesus is making a major point or making a massive enemy, he is at a dinner party. Why is eating such a big deal in this text?
Because in the ancient Mediterranean, eating was never just eating.
What was it then?
A meal, especially a formal dinner party known as a symposium, or one set in a triclinium, which is a dining room with reclining couches, was a microcosm of the social hierarchy. It was theological theater.
Theological theater, I like that.
Who you invited, where they sat, and what they were served communicated their exact worth. Furthermore, you did not share a table with anyone below your class, and you certainly avoided anyone who was a sinner or ritually unclean.
Because of the honor-shame dynamic again.
Exactly. The cultural belief was that their impurity and shame would literally transfer to you through the shared food.
It's the ultimate middle school cafeteria anxiety, but with massive religious and social consequences. If you sit at the wrong table, you are socially dead.
Precisely. So imagine the shockwaves when Jesus accepts an invitation to dine with the Pharisee.
The religious elite, the gatekeepers of purity.
Right. But instead of playing the patronage game and praising his host, Jesus openly critiques their obsession with status and their neglect of justice while sitting at their own table.
That's a fast way to get uninvited. But then he takes it a step further, right? He doesn't just critique the elite, he actively seeks out the outcasts. The story of Zacchaeus perfectly captures this.
Zacchaeus is the ultimate example of the upside-down kingdom in action. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector in the city of Jericho.
And people hated tax collectors.
Oh, to understand the hatred for tax collectors, you have to know that they were local Jewish citizens who had contracted with the occupying Roman military to extract tolls and taxes from their own people.
So they were seen as traitors.
Completely. They were allowed to keep whatever extra they could extort. They were incredibly wealthy, but they were viewed as traitors, extortionists, and religiously bankrupt. They were the scum of the earth.
And Jesus is passing through Jericho, surrounded by crowds, and he spots Zacchaeus up in a tree. And what does he do? He invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house for dinner.
He publicly associates himself with the most despised man in the city. He risks absolute social contamination.
Just blows up the whole honor-shame system?
Yes. And the crucial theological point here is the order of events. Jesus extends grace and table fellowship before Zacchaeus repents, or changes his ways.
Oh, wow. The unmerited grace is what causes the repentance.
Exactly. Zacchaeus is so overwhelmed by this non-transactional love that he immediately promises to give half his wealth to the poor and repay anyone he cheated fourfold. God's kingdom bypasses the patronage system entirely. It's a gift of grace that transforms economics.
It's brilliant. And what blew my mind when looking at the overall structure of this book is that this radical social reorientation isn't just taught in the parables or at the dinner tables. It is literally mapped out in the geographic structure of the gospel itself.
It is.
The author uses geography as a theological roadmap.
Luke is an incredibly deliberate literary architect. He organizes the story to build escalating tension.
How does the map work?
The macrostructure moves from the preparation of Jesus in the wilderness up to the initial ministry in Galilee in the north. Then it moves down through the boundary region of Samaria, passes through the oasis city of Jericho, and finally ascends up the dangerous, winding road into Jerusalem.
The epicenter of religious power.
Right, and the inevitable site of conflict.
And there is a specific, razor-sharp turning point where this journey officially begins. It's in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. The text says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem.
Yes.
That phrase, set his face, it just gives you chills. It implies this absolute, unbreakable determination. He knows exactly what the authorities are going to do to him there, and he starts walking straight toward them anyway.
That verse is the structural hinge of the entire gospel. From chapter 9, verse 51, all the way through chapter 19, we enter a massive central section of the book that scholars refer to as the travel narrative.
The travel narrative.
Yes, and what is fascinating about this section is that even though they are physically traveling, the actual geography almost fades into the background. The journey itself becomes a literary corridor for discipleship formation.
I thought of it like a classic road trip movie. Think about two characters driving cross-country. The physical stops, the gas stations, the motels, they don't really matter. The real story is the psychological transformation happening inside the car. The arguments, the confessions, the realizations.
That's a perfect analogy.
But why did Luke decide to cluster so much teaching into a road trip, rather than just giving us a day-by-day diary?
Because the physical road to Jerusalem represents an escalating theological tension. Jerusalem is the city of the temple, the seat of the Sanhedrin, and historically, the city that kills the prophets.
Right. It's marching toward the lion's den.
By structuring the middle of the gospel as a long, deliberate march toward death, Luke creates a high-stakes crucible for teaching. As they walk this dangerous road, Jesus is defining exactly what it will cost to follow him.
And it is entirely within this travel narrative that we find some of the most iconic, famous parables in all of human literature.
Absolutely.
This is the section where we get the heavy hitters. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the rich man and Lazarus, the persistent widow. It's like a greatest hits album of Jesus' teachings, all happening while the dust of the road is on their sandals.
And when you analyze those specific parables, they all relentlessly reinforce that theme of the upside-down kingdom. Take the Good Samaritan, for instance.
Yeah, let's look at that one.
To a modern ear, Good Samaritan just means someone who helps change a flat tire. But in the first century, the Jews and the Samaritans despised each other. The hatred went back centuries, rooted in the Assyrian exile, intermarriage, and bitter disputes over where the true temple of God was located.
So they were enemies.
Bitter enemies. To a Jewish audience, a Good Samaritan was an oxymoron. So when Jesus tells a story where the religious elites, a priest and a Levite, walk past a dying man to preserve their ritual purity, and it is the despised Samaritan who stops, spends his own money, and saves the man, it is deeply offensive.
Because he's making the ethnic outsider the hero of neighborly love.
Exactly. He shatters their categories.
And the prodigal son does the exact same thing with honor and shame, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In that parable, the younger son demands his inheritance early, which is essentially telling his father, I wish you were dead.
Wow, yeah.
He liquidates the family assets, moves away, and loses everything in absolute disgrace, ending up feeding pigs, which is the height of ritual impurity for a Jew.
Right, total rock bottom.
When he drags himself home, the cultural expectation of the honor sham society is that the father should beat him, banish him, or at best make him a slave to pay off the debt.
But the father doesn't do that.
No. The father sees him from a distance, lifts his robes, which was deeply undignified for an elder patriarch to do, and literally sprints down the road to embrace the shamed son.
He takes the shame on himself.
Yes. And he throws a lavish party for him. Meanwhile, the older brother, the dutiful son who obeyed all the rules and maintained his status, refuses to go into the party. He is left standing outside in the dark, furious at his father's grace.
It is a devastating critique of the religious elite who felt they had earned God's favor through rule-keeping.
The subversion is just relentless.
And Luke is weaving all these stories together with a very sophisticated literary tool. As I was reading the textual analysis, it highlighted a specific Greek word that Luke uses over and over again on this journey to Jerusalem. The word is deki, D-E-I.
Ah, yes.
What is the significance of this tiny word?
Degi is a Greek verb that roughly translates to "it is necessary" or "it must be." Luke uses this word repeatedly to describe Jesus' destiny.
Give me some examples.
Well, he says, "I must preach the good news. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected. Everything written about me must be fulfilled." It conveys a profound sense of divine necessity.
So it's not just fate or bad luck.
Exactly. Jesus isn't a tragic victim of circumstance. He isn't just an inspiring moral teacher who accidentally ran afoul of corrupt politicians and got crushed by the system.
The use of day tells the reader that the impending collision in Jerusalem is an ordained fulfillment of God's redemptive plan.
Yes. Jesus is consciously embodying the story of Israel, taking the climax of that ancient story upon his own shoulders.
Which means this march to Jerusalem is a collision course. The upside-down kingdom of God is about to violently crash into the dominant right-side-up powers of the Roman era. The tension that has been building for chapters finally snaps.
You see that snap the moment Jesus enters Jerusalem. You have the famous triumphal entry with the crowds waving branches and shouting praises.
Right.
But Luke intentionally contrasts this peasant procession on a donkey with the heavily armed militaristic triumph of a Roman general.
It's a parody of Roman power.
Precisely. And immediately after this entry, Luke inserts a deeply poignant moment where Jesus looks out over the city of Jerusalem and begins to weep. He prophesies its future destruction by Rome, which would happen historically in 70 CE because, as he says, the city did not recognize the time of God's coming.
And from there, we move into the shadows. We reach the Last Supper. The table fellowship we've been tracking this whole time reaches its ultimate final expression.
Yes. The setting is the Passover meal, the definitive foundational story of Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt.
But he changes the meaning, doesn't he?
He does. Jesus takes the bread and the wine of this ancient ritual and reinterprets them around his own impending death. He says, "This is my body given for you. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you."
So he is taking an execution and framing it covenantally. He is saying, my death is the new Exodus. It is the mechanism of ultimate liberation.
Which is profound.
But the authorities certainly don't see it as liberation. They see him as a massive political threat. We get the betrayal, the arrest, and then these rapid-fire trials. He is dragged before the Jewish Religious Council, the Sanhedrin. Then he is sent to Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect.
Right.
Pilate sends him to Herod Antipas, the local tetrarch, who mocks him and sends him back to Pilate. And throughout all this legal chaos, the author does something very specific. He goes out of his way to highlight the complete innocence of Jesus and the absolute irony of human authority.
This is a crucial aspect of Luke's political theology. During the Roman trial, Pilate repeatedly says to the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." Herod finds no fault either.
The trial scenes are dripping with dark irony.
They really are, because Pilate, Caiaphas, and Herod all believe they're the ones exercising ultimate power. They think they're the prime movers of history, disposing of a nuisance peasant.
But the reader knows better.
Exactly. Through that concept of divine necessity, human authority is actually being exposed as corrupt, cowardly, and entirely subordinate to a higher purpose. Pilate thinks he is passing a death sentence, but he is unwittingly executing the salvation of the world.
The cross in Luke is both a brutal historical execution under the boot of Roman power and, paradoxically, the exact instrument of God's saving plan. It's the ultimate reversal.
Beautifully stated.
But of course, the story doesn't end in the tomb. We arrive at chapter 24, the resurrection, and specifically, we get the Emmaus Road narrative. And I have to say, this might be the most brilliant piece of storytelling in the entire book.
Oh, the Emmaus Road is a narrative masterpiece. Let's break down how Luke constructs it.
Okay, so it is Sunday, the third day after the crucifixion. But two of Jesus's disciples are leaving Jerusalem, walking away toward a village called Emmaus. They are absolutely crushed. Their hopes are shattered.
Right, they think it's all over.
As they are walking, a stranger joins them on the road, but the text says they are kept from recognizing him. The stranger asks why they're so sad, and they basically unload all their trauma on him. They explain how Jesus of Nazareth, who they hoped was the Redeemer of Israel, was executed by the state.
And what does the stranger say?
He listens and then essentially says, "How foolish you are. Didn't you realize the Messiah had to suffer these things to enter his glory?" And as they walk, he proceeds to open up the ancient scriptures from Moses through the prophets, explaining how it all pointed to this exact moment.
It is a phenomenal setup.
Yeah.
But the climax doesn't happen during the Bible study on the road. The climax happens when they finally arrive at the village of Emmaus.
At dinner again.
Yes. The day is ending, so they invite the stranger inside to eat. They sit down at the table. The guest takes the bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and begins to hand it to them. And in that exact, precise action, in the breaking of the bread, their eyes are opened.
They suddenly recognize that the stranger is the risen Christ, and instantly he vanishes from their sight.
Such a powerful moment.
It is exactly like watching a movie with a massive twist ending, like The Sixth Sense. The moment the twist is revealed at the table, it forces the disciples and the reader to instantly replay everything they just experienced, suddenly realizing all the clues they missed along the way.
That is precisely what Luke is doing. The Emmaus Road is a hermeneutical masterclass.
Hermeneutical.
Yeah, hermeneutics is simply the study of how we interpret texts. And what the risen Christ does on that road is provide the interpretive key for the entire Hebrew Bible. He's arguing that the cross was not an interruption of God's plan. The cross is the plan.
The suffering was the necessary path to glory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And notice the twin pillars of where recognition occurs. It requires both the exposition of Scripture on the road and the table fellowship of the meal, word and sacrament.
And the resurrection itself, in this context, isn't just a neat magic trick to prove there is an afterlife. It acts as a divine vindication. God is overturning the verdict of the highest courts in the world.
Yes.
The Roman Empire and the religious council said, "This man is guilty and cursed." And God raises him from the dead to say, "No, he is innocent and exalted."
Is the final, ultimate subversion of worldly power. And this leads directly into the ascension, the final scene of the gospel. Jesus blesses his disciples and is taken up into heaven.
Which tees up his next book.
Exactly. This completes his earthly geographical journey, and it perfectly tees up Luke's sequel, the book of Acts, where the Holy Spirit will be poured out and the mission will expand from Jerusalem to the very ends of the earth.
Which means, having reached the climax of the narrative, we need to zoom out. We've been looking at the trees, but now we need to look at the massive theological forest Luke has grown. We need to look at the grand tapestry he's woven from chapter 1 to chapter 24. What are the dominant foundational themes driving this entire document?
To really grasp the depth of Luke, you have to break down his theology into a few key areas. The first is his pneumatology.
Which is a very fancy word for the study of the Holy Spirit.
Yes. In the original Greek, the phrase is pneumahagion, which literally means holy breath or holy wind. Luke is arguably the most overtly pneumatological of all the Gospels.
Oh, so?
The Holy Spirit is the animating force of every major event. The Spirit overshadows Mary to cause the conception. The Spirit fills Elizabeth and Zechariah to prophesy. The Spirit descends visibly on Jesus at his baptism and then immediately drives him into the wilderness to be tested.
So the Spirit is everywhere.
Everywhere. When Jesus preaches his very first sermon in his hometown of Nazareth, he unrolls the scroll of Isaiah and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." You simply cannot understand the mission of Jesus in Luke without understanding the absolute empowerment of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so that's the power source, but what is the actual goal of the mission? That brings us to soteriology, the theology of salvation. And to understand salvation in Luke, we have to look at a specific Greek word, aphesis.
Aphesis is a crucial concept. In most English Bibles, it is translated simply as forgiveness.
Right.
And while that is technically correct, it completely misses the massive historical weight of the term in a first-century Jewish context. For a Jewish reader, aphesis carries the reverberating echo of the ancient Jubilee.
Oh, let's explain the Jubilee, because this completely blew my mind when I learned how this economic system was supposed to work.
It's an amazing concept. In the ancient laws of the Torah, the Jubilee was commanded as a radical economic and social reset button for the entire nation.
And it happened every 50 years, right?
Yes. Every 50 years, a trumpet was to be sounded and a massive release was triggered. All debts were completely canceled. Anyone who had sold themselves into slavery to pay off debt was freed.
Wow.
And crucially, all ancestral land that had been lost or sold to creditors was returned to its original family. It was a structural safeguard designed to prevent extreme wealth inequality and generational poverty.
So when a peasant farmer who has lost his grandfather's land to a wealthy Roman patron hears Jesus using the word aphesis, he isn't just thinking about a warm, private feeling of having his moral sins wiped away.
Exactly. He is thinking about comprehensive liberation. In Luke, salvation is forgiveness, yes, but it is deeply integrated. It is physical healing, social restoration, and economic justice. It is the release of captives from every form of bondage, spiritual, physical, and societal.
Which ties perfectly into how Luke views humanity, his anthropology. Why do humans need this radical jubilee?
Because in Luke's eyes, humans are fundamentally needy, sinful, and hopelessly lost. Think of the famous parables in chapter 15, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son.
They can't save themselves.
Right? The sheep cannot find its own way back. The coin cannot find itself. We are incapable of saving ourselves through our own righteousness or our own patronage networks. We require the unmerited radical mercy and aphesis that only God can provide.
And this mercy isn't random. The author makes a point to show that this is grounded in ancient covenant logic. Luke is constantly showing how Jesus is fulfilling the promises God made thousands of years earlier.
Yes, the Abrahamic promise, which was a guarantee to bring blessing to all nations of the earth, and the Davidic covenant, the promise that a descendant of King David would rule on an eternal throne.
Luke is synthesizing all of this to say God keeps his promises, and Jesus is the ultimate proof.
The theology is profound, and structurally it holds together beautifully. But as we're doing a deep dive into the sources, we also have to confront the textual mysteries. The manuscript tradition for the Gospel of Luke is ancient, vast, and incredibly robust. But it is not without complex debates. There are a few major textual cruxes, specific verses that scholars have wrestled with for centuries.
Right, and as I was looking through the data, two highly famous passages jumped out as being heavily debated. The first is in Luke chapter 22, verses 43 and 44.
A garden scene.
Exactly. This is the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying in absolute agony before his arrest. The text says an angel appears to strengthen him, and his sweat becomes like great drops of blood falling to the ground. It is an incredibly visceral, iconic image of human suffering.
And the second passage.
The second passage is in chapter 23, verse 34. Jesus is hanging on the cross. The soldiers are gambling for his clothes, and he looks down and says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." It is perhaps the most famous prayer of forgiveness in history, but what is the actual issue with these verses?
The issue lies in the manuscript evidence. When textual critics examine the absolute earliest, the most reliable Greek papyri we possess, including that early P75 papyrus we mentioned earlier, and ancient codices like Vaticanus, these specific verses are entirely missing.
Missing completely.
They simply do not appear in the oldest copies.
Yeah.
They show up in later manuscript traditions, but their absence in the earliest, most geographically diverse witnesses makes them text critically doubtful. Many scholars believe they were later insertions by scribes.
Okay, let me stop you there because this is where a lot of people might throw their hands up. If I'm listening to this and I find out that the sweat like blood passage or the ultimate prayer of forgiveness from the cross might be later additions inserted by a scribe centuries after the fact, how do I handle that uncertainty? Doesn't that shatter the investigative journalist credibility we talked about in the very beginning?
That is a very fair anxiety to have. But this is where the practice of rigorous textual criticism is actually our friend. Textual criticism is about honesty and transparency with the historical data. Recognizing variations in ancient manuscripts doesn't destroy the gospel's core reliability.
So.
In fact, it shows us the living, breathing history of how the text was preserved, copied, and sometimes glossed by early Christian communities who were deeply moved by the story.
So why would a scribe add those verses in the first place?
Well, the sweat like blood may have been inserted to heavily emphasize Jesus' physical, agonizing humanity to combat early heresies that claimed Jesus was purely a divine spirit who didn't really suffer.
A theological correction.
Right. And the Father, forgive them prayer, might have been an authentic, floating oral tradition of Jesus' teachings that a later scribe felt perfectly fit the narrative of the crucifixion, so they inserted it. But here is the crucial point. Even if those specific verses are later additions, the core theology of Luke remains completely intact.
Because the rest of the book supports it anyway.
Exactly. Because the theology isn't dependent on one verse. Even without the sweat like blood, the Gethsemane narrative clearly portrays Jesus wrestling in intense, agonizing submission to the Father's will.
And without the prayer on the cross.
Even without the specific phrase, Father, forgive them. The entire arc of the gospel, from Jesus healing the paralyzed man, to eating with Zacchaeus, to loving his enemies, demonstrates a God who offers radical forgiveness. The foundation of a spirit-empowered, covenant-keeping God doesn't collapse just because a scribe later added a profound oral tradition into the margins.
That makes a lot of sense. And we also have to acknowledge how the author built this narrative in the first place. The research points heavily to the synoptic problem. This is the scholarly consensus that Luke didn't write in a vacuum.
No, he certainly didn't.
He likely had a copy of the Gospel of Mark on his desk. This is called Mark in priority. He used Mark as a narrative spine. But he also had access to another source, a hypothetical document scholars call Q, from the German word Quell, meaning source, which was a collection of Jesus' sayings that both Luke and Matthew used.
Which brings us right back to the prologue. When Luke says he investigated handed-down accounts, he is telling the truth.
He's showing his work.
Exactly. He is a brilliant editor and theologian, taking the raw material of Mark, the sayings of Q, and his own unique research like the extensive focus on women and the parables of the marginalized, and weaving them into this unique, soaring architectural vision.
It is a beautifully complex, deeply human process of preserving history, which makes me want to pivot. We have spent an hour deep in the weeds of ancient Greek manuscripts, historical debates about Quirinius and first-century patronage systems. But if you are listening to this right now, driving your car or washing the dishes, you might be asking, why does a text about a first-century marginalized community matter to my life in the 21st century?
That's the most important question.
Right. How does the Gospel of Luke echo into our modern reality?
The contemporary relevance of Luke is staggering, frankly. And the reason it remains relevant is because human nature, power dynamics, and the anxieties of society haven't fundamentally changed in 2,000 years.
The empires just have different names.
Exactly. The empires have different names, the technology is different, but the underlying realities of wealth, poverty, status, and exclusion are exactly the same.
Let's talk about wealth. Because if you have ever felt a knot in your stomach about money, or if you are looking at the massive, crushing economic inequality of our modern world, Luke is speaking directly into that anxiety. The analysis shows that Luke absolutely refuses to romanticize wealth.
This is a vital point for modern readers. We often see two extremes in modern culture. Some ideologies view wealth as an automatic sign of virtue, intelligence, or even divine blessing, a kind of modern prosperity gospel.
Right. If you're rich, God must love you.
Exactly. On the flip side, some romanticize poverty as an inherently holy or pure state. Luke rejects both. He exposes the deep spiritual delusion of wealth and self-sufficiency.
The parable of the rich fool is a perfect example of this, isn't it?
It is. Jesus tells a story about a wealthy landowner who has a bumper crop. Instead of sharing it, he tears down his barns to build massive new ones to hoard all the excess. He tells his soul, "You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry."
He thinks his wealth guarantees his security.
But God says to him, "You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you." Luke is warning that wealth creates a terrifying illusion of control. And conversely, as we saw with Zacchaeus, true spiritual awakening in Luke inevitably results in concrete economic justice. You cannot separate your spiritual health from how you handle your wallet.
It is deeply convicting, and Luke also speaks so powerfully to our modern crisis of identity and belonging. If you have ever scrolled through social media and felt that pang of not having the right car, the right vacation, the right status, you were experiencing the modern version of the honor and shame culture.
Absolutely.
If you have ever been deemed the wrong kind of person by cultural gatekeepers, Luke is your text.
Luke provides a robust, unshakable theology for the marginalized. By making the hated Samaritan the hero of neighborly love, by elevating women to the role of ultimate witnesses, and by prioritizing the poor, Luke insists that the center of God's activity is never found in the insulated halls of power. It is found on the fringes. It dignifies the outsider.
And speaking of those halls of power, Luke provides a massive reality check regarding the accountability of public leaders. We spent all that time talking about Augustus, Pilate, and Herod. They thought they controlled the narrative.
But they didn't.
Right. Luke reminds us that human rulers are not ultimate. Their power is temporary, heavily flawed, and entirely subject to divine judgment. In a modern political climate that constantly demands our absolute allegiance, Luke says, keep your perspective. These empires will fall too.
And finally, Luke offers a profound synthesis of faith and intellect. In a modern world that often forces us to choose, telling us that faith requires abandoning rigorous historical inquiry, or that intellectual rigor destroys spiritual mystery. Luke proves that is a false dichotomy.
They can coexist.
More than coexist. Christianity, in Luke's vision, is not a detached philosophical idea. It is rooted in real events, real dirt, real witnesses, and a historically grounded resurrection. It provides a blueprint for extending radical mercy to the outcast while maintaining absolute moral seriousness and intellectual depth.
It is a totally integrated vision of life. And as we wrap up this massive deep dive, I want to take a second to recap the incredible territory we've covered today.
We covered a lot.
We really did. We started with an author acting as a meticulous investigative historian, utilizing Greco-Roman literary tools. We dug through the archaeological dirt of Caesarea, confirming the existence of Roman prefects while honestly wrestling with the chronological puzzle of the Quirinius census.
Right.
We explored a socially upside-down kingdom that threatened the mafia-like patronage system, where women and outcasts are invited to the VIP table. We traveled that long, relentless theological road to Jerusalem, watching divine necessity unfold. And we arrived at a cross and an empty tomb that completely rewrote the interpretive lens of the ancient world.
It truly is a breathtaking achievement. It is a text that demands to be wrestled with.
I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for taking this journey with us, for diving deep into the weeds of ancient historiography, first-century sociology, and Greek manuscript traditions. It is a lot to process, but it is so deeply rewarding.
If I could leave one closing thought, summarizing our findings, it would be the enduring beauty of Luke's gospel is its refusal to divide the world.
Say more about that.
It proves that you do not have to choose between historical rigor, complex theology, and a bleeding heart for the poor and marginalized. In Luke, they are not competing interests. They are one unified, magnificent story of redemption.
That is beautifully said. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought, something for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your week.
Let's hear it.
Think back to those two crushed disciples walking on the dusty road to Emmaus. They had all the facts. They had lived through the history. They knew the political timeline. They knew the theology. They knew the tragedy of the cross.
But they still missed it.
Right. But they were walking right beside the absolute truth, and they didn't recognize it. They didn't see it until their perspective was fundamentally shifted, and they sat down to break bread with a stranger.
Wow.
It makes you wonder, in our own lives, amidst all our information overload, all our deep dives, all our historical facts, and endless news feeds, what profound truths are walking right beside us, disguised in the ordinary, just waiting for us to invite them to the table.